August 14th, 1965, just north of Chu Lai, South Vietnam. The humidity was heavy enough to bead on a man's rifle. At 7:42, a strange rhythm rolled through the jungle canopy. First a faint whine, then a deep chopping thrum that grew until it felt as if the ground itself vibrated. Viet Cong scouts flattened into the grass and froze, scanning the tree line. They'd learned what that sound meant. It wasn't artillery. It wasn't the passing scream of a fighter jet that came and went in an instant. This sound lingered, pulsed, advanced. Then the helicopters appeared, 6 UH-1Ds, side doors open, machine gun barrels glinting in the tropical sun. The American soldiers they carried were still 50 feet above the trees when the first rockets fired from the lead ship. The explosions cracked through the valley, and within moments, U.S. infantry were pouring onto a patch of clearing no wider than a basketball court. To the Viet Cong watching from the ridge, it felt impossible. They'd marched for weeks through mud, and now, in under a minute, an entire platoon had arrived from the sky. That was why they feared the Huey. Jets were predictable. They announced themselves with roar and speed, striking and leaving before the dust settled. The Huey didn't leave. It circled. It waited. It returned for the wounded, for reinforcements, for supplies. It meant the fight never stopped, and it turned any remote hillside into a landing zone and any landing zone into a forward base. The Bell UH-1 Iroquois, quickly nicknamed the Huey from its early HU-1 designation, was never intended to terrify anyone. When Bell engineers first proposed it in 1952, the U.S. Army saw it as a practical ambulance. A single-engine, lightweight helicopter to replace the tiny Korean War choppers that could lift only 2 stretchers. But Bell's design team, working out of Fort Worth, Texas, had bigger ambitions. They wanted a rotary wing aircraft that behaved like a utility truck of the sky, easy to maintain, able to haul anything, and rugged enough to fly day after day from dirt clearings in any weather. At its heart was a new power plant, the Lycoming T-53 turboshaft engine, the first reliable turbine ever mounted in a mass-produced helicopter. It produced 1,100 horsepower while weighing barely half what the piston engines of earlier aircraft did. That single leap changed everything. A helicopter could now lift twice its previous load, run smoother, and start instantly even in tropical heat. The Huey's entire frame was built around that turbine, a semi-monocoque aluminum fuselage with minimal parts, a wide cabin that could seat 12 troops or 6 stretchers, and twin sliding side doors that allowed loading from either side in seconds. For mechanics accustomed to babying fragile piston engines, the Huey's T-53 was a revelation. It tolerated dirt, humidity, and neglect. It could run for 600 hours before requiring overhaul, numbers unheard of in rotary wing aviation at the time. And unlike the complex, hand-fitted gearboxes of European helicopters, the Huey's transmission used standard-sized components that could be swapped in the field with wrenches and a Jeep jack. American engineers had designed a flying machine that could be maintained by sergeants, not scientists. By 1962, when the first UH-1s arrived in Vietnam, the war had already proven how essential that philosophy was. The country's geography defied conventional supply lines. Roads vanished in the rainy season, bridges washed out, and mountain trails turned to rivers of mud. Traditional armor couldn't move, and even trucks bogged down within days. Yet, the Huey could leapfrog all of it. It didn't need a road. It didn't even need a flat field. Just 60 feet of semi-clear space, and a pilot confident enough to plant the skids. The first unit to put that theory to the test was the 57th Medical Detachment. They flew UH-1 as painted with red crosses, landing under fire to pull out wounded soldiers from jungle firefights where no ground vehicle could reach. The statistics astonished commanders. Evacuation time from point of injury to hospital dropped from 4 hours to less than 30 minutes. Survival rates skyrocketed. What started as a medical tool was quietly rewriting every rule of battlefield movement. The Army noticed. In 1963, the 11th Air Assault Division was formed to test a radical doctrine: air mobility. The Huey wasn't just transport anymore, it was the backbone of a new kind of warfare. Instead of advancing along supply routes like World War II convoys, American units would fly directly to combat zones, fight, then redeploy within hours. In Vietnam, that meant one thing: the enemy could never predict where the next fight would erupt. By 1965, the first major air mobile operation, Ia Drang, proved the idea worked. Hundreds of Hueys shuttled soldiers, artillery, ammunition, and medical teams between mountain valleys while under constant fire. Each aircraft averaged 10 missions per day, some over 14 hours of flight in 110-degree heat. Pilots called it flying a truck through a thunderstorm. For the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, it was worse. They realized the Americans could appear anywhere, anytime. Captured diaries from the period show what that realization felt like on the ground. One North Vietnamese officer described the noise as a drumbeat of fear, the signal that death comes from the sky but stays to fight on the ground. He wasn't exaggerating. The Huey's side-mounted M60 machine guns could rake tree lines while door gunners fired thousands of rounds per sortie. Rocket-armed gunship versions, designated UH-1B and UH-1C, added pods of 2.75-inch rockets capable of pulverizing bunkers before troop insertion. To U.S. engineers, these modifications were proof of concept. They had built a modular aircraft, a platform adaptable to any role: gunship, ambulance, command post, supply lifter, or troop transport. Each configuration used the same core airframe and drivetrain, which meant every part was interchangeable. That was the same industrial logic that had made American logistics unstoppable in the 1940s: standardization. By mid-1966, Bell Helicopter's Fort Worth factory was producing a new Huey every 30 minutes. Over 7,000 would serve in Vietnam. At the height of the war, the Army estimated 1 helicopter for every 35 combat soldiers, a ratio never achieved before or since. The aircraft's constant presence changed not only tactics, but psychology. To American troops pinned down under fire, the sound of incoming rotors meant rescue. To the enemy, it meant doom. In just a few years, a helicopter that began as a simple utility vehicle had turned into the most feared machine in the theater. It didn't have the speed of a jet or the glamour of a bomber, but it was always there, above the jungle, hovering, ready to strike or save. That reliability, born in engineering labs a decade earlier, was the true weapon. By 1966, Bell engineers had turned what began as a medical evacuation platform into the most versatile aircraft in military history. But the true secret of the Huey's success wasn't what it carried. It was how it kept flying. Every engineer involved understood one brutal truth about Vietnam: if a helicopter couldn't stay in the air through mud, heat, dust, and enemy fire, it wasn't just a maintenance problem, it was a dead pilot, a lost squad, or an isolated unit cut off in the jungle. So they designed the Huey like no aircraft before it, not as a machine for pilots, but as a machine for mechanics. The main rotor system, the beating heart of any helicopter, had always been a nightmare of complexity. European designs used rigid rotor hubs with intricate linkages that demanded constant adjustment. Bell's engineers went the other direction. They used a semi-rigid teetering rotor, a design so simple it looked primitive, yet it transformed helicopter reliability. 2 blades attached to a single yoke could flap and feather together as one unit. That meant fewer moving parts, easier balance, and less stress on the gearbox. When tested in tropical conditions, it proved nearly indestructible. In 1964, Bell's test pilots at Fort Worth deliberately flew Hueys through simulated brownout dust clouds, the swirling clouds of dirt that could choke engines and blind pilots. They discovered the aircraft could hover for 6 minutes in zero visibility, land, and take off again without power loss. The T-53 engine, protected by its centrifugal air filter, kept running clean, while sand shredded everything else. The Army ordered every production Huey fitted with that same filtration system. But Bell's engineers didn't stop there. They worked with field maintenance crews in Vietnam, collecting handwritten notes and radio messages describing real-world failures. Bearings that wore out faster in heat, seals that cracked in humidity, or hoses that hardened in aviation fuel exposure, every report was logged, analyzed, and updated into the next production batch. By late 1966, Hueys coming off the line were already on their third generation of small improvements, most invisible to the pilots, but critical to keeping them alive. It was an evolving system, one that could adapt faster than the enemy could learn to fight it. And that adaptability came from a new kind of industrial mindset that Germany had never achieved during the previous war: modular mass production. Each Huey shared 85% of its components with every other. Gearboxes, fuel pumps, rotor blades, even instrument panels were interchangeable across dozens of variants. When a Huey went down in the field, mechanics didn't wait for factory parts. They stripped one to fix another, swapped sub-assemblies like Lego blocks, and got the aircraft airborne again within hours. The result was staggering operational readiness. In 1967, U.S. Army records showed that even with combat damage and weather, Hueys maintained a 77% flight availability rate, higher than most fixed-wing fighters of the era. For an aircraft flying in monsoon humidity, dust, and combat zones, that was unprecedented, and the pilots trusted it. They learned that if they could get a Huey off the ground, it would get them back. That trust built a fighting doctrine the world had never seen: the air cavalry. The 1st Cavalry Division, reformed and re-equipped entirely around helicopters, operated like a fast-moving chessboard. A single company could airlift 400 men, artillery, ammunition, and fuel to a new landing zone in under an hour. Within 48 hours, they could shift an entire brigade 100 miles through jungle without a road. The numbers told the story. During Operation Silver Bayonet, in November 1965, 435 helicopters delivered 16,000 troops and 2,000 tons of equipment over trackless terrain. The enemy, relying on bicycles and porters, had no way to match that mobility. The Huey's twin side doors, originally meant for ambulance stretchers, now became firing platforms. Gunners mounted M60 machine guns on pintle mounts, each fed by belts of 7.62 ammunition snaking across the cabin floor. The sound of those twin guns hammering from open doors became the signature noise of the war, a rolling thunder that sent ground troops diving for cover long before the Huey was visible. It wasn't invincible. Small arms fire riddled thin aluminum skins, and ground fire brought hundreds down every year. But it was fixable. Mechanics in Da Nang and Pleiku developed a field repair system that mirrored Detroit assembly lines. Damaged Hueys were hauled to makeshift hangars, stripped to bare frames, and rebuilt in 48 hours using parts from wrecks. At one point in 1967, Bell's regional depot in Saigon processed over 300 major component replacements per week. Blades, transmissions, and engines all swapped in open-air workshops powered by floodlights and welding rigs. No other aircraft in history had been treated this way, like a tool instead of a treasure. And that attitude made it the perfect war machine for an imperfect war. By the late 1960s, the UH-1 family had grown into a sprawling lineage. The B model introduced shorter blades and rocket mounts for gunship rolls. The C model widened the chord and reinforced the fuselage for heavier armament. The D and H variants stretched the cabin for more troops and added larger 1,400 horsepower engines that could lift over 2 tons of payload. Yet they all looked the same, and that was the genius of it. To an enemy on the ground, it didn't matter which variant was coming in. They all brought the same terror, firepower, mobility, and the promise of relentless pursuit. American troops often described the Huey not as a vehicle, but as a presence. You could hear it before you saw it, and once you heard it, you couldn't forget it. It was the one sound that could cut through monsoon rain, artillery, and jungle noise alike. Journalists in-country began calling it the sound of Vietnam. Soldiers called it the heartbeat of the war. Behind that sound was pure engineering rhythm, 324 revolutions per second, each rotor tip moving faster than the speed of sound. The blades flexed under enormous stress, yet they held. They flexed because they held. Bell's decision to use composite spars and aluminum honeycomb trailing edges instead of solid steel made the Huey's blades both light and resilient. When enemy fire hit, the rotor could survive multiple bullet holes and still maintain lift. Many pilots returned with entire chunks missing from their blades. That durability became legend. Stories circulated across air bases of Hueys landing with 100 bullet holes and still flying the next day. Engineers back in Texas took those stories as design feedback, reinforcing fuel lines, adding self-sealing tanks, and upgrading gearbox seals for tropical exposure. It was a feedback loop that spanned oceans, field improvisation in Asia driving design evolution in America. And it worked. By 1968, Bell's engineers and Army logisticians had created the most efficient aerial machine in the world's most inefficient war. Every part had a reason. Every weakness was logged. Every repair was studied. The Huey was no longer just an aircraft. It was a system. And like all American systems born of necessity, it got faster, cheaper, and more reliable the longer it ran. Enemy forces recognized it too. Viet Cong units began plotting ambushes based not on troop movements, but on helicopter routes. Intelligence intercepts recorded units warning each other, "Don't engage where you hear the rotors. There will be more behind them." The helicopter had changed not only combat logistics, but combat psychology. For the first time in history, armies weren't defined by how far they could march or how many tanks they could field, but by how quickly they could lift and move by air. The Huey had made that possible, and in doing so had changed the logic of warfare itself. By 1967, the Huey had become more than an aircraft. It was the core around which the entire American war effort in Vietnam revolved. Every operation, every tactical plan, and every evacuation hinged on its presence. Commanders planned battles not around terrain, but around flight range. Infantry divisions fought not along front lines, but along flight paths. The helicopter had done something no jet ever could. It erased geography as a constraint. In that same year, Army engineers began calling the Huey the fifth element: earth, air, fire, water. And now, the machine that blended all four. It could move like air, land on earth, rise through fire, and survive monsoon water. But its design was tested harder that year than ever before. Vietnam's heat, grit, and constant flying hours punished machines with the consistency of time itself. Helicopters that were supposed to fly 50 hours a month were logging 200. Transmissions ran at 220 degrees Fahrenheit in midday heat. Rotor blades warped from humidity. Yet still, they flew. Bell's engineers back home received crates filled with worn components from field depots. Not to discard, but to study. They measured scoring marks, fatigue cracks, and thermal discoloration, using each as evidence in a larger experiment. How to make a machine last forever in conditions that killed engines daily. The findings led to dozens of small but revolutionary improvements. They hardened transmission gears with new nickel alloys. They switched hydraulic seals from natural rubber to synthetic compounds that wouldn't soften in aviation fuel. They redesigned wiring harnesses with flexible sheathing to resist tropical fungus that literally ate insulation. To the men flying them, these details were invisible. But to the engineers, every small fix meant another Huey that would come home instead of crash into jungle. The mechanics in Vietnam called these changes Texas miracles, because most of them originated in Bell's Fort Worth lab. But they weren't miracles. They were industrial logic, the same formula that had built America's wartime factories 2 decades earlier. Fix it fast. Fix it simple. Fix it for good. Every American base had a rotor graveyard, rows of damaged blades, cracked transmissions, and bent tail booms. Yet those piles weren't junk. They were resources. Soldiers stripped them down, scavenged usable parts, and rebuilt what they could. The Huey was so modular that you could disassemble and reassemble one in the field using a Jeep winch and hand tools. Entire frames were swapped like puzzle pieces. The Army's 610th Maintenance Battalion once rebuilt 12 destroyed helicopters in a single week, under tarps, in the rain. That same year, the Huey evolved again. Engineers at Bell and the Army's Aviation Materiel Command began experimenting with new mission profiles. One of the first was the Slick and Snake system, pairing unarmed transport Hueys, known as Slicks, with heavily armed escort versions nicknamed gunships. The UH-1C became the first true gunship variant, its stubby rocket pods and twin M60s marking a transition from utility craft to flying artillery. What had started as improvisation soon became doctrine. Gunships flew low, clearing landing zones with rockets and machine gun fire seconds before Slicks dropped off infantry. The choreography was astonishing. 5 helicopters landing within 100 meters of each other, firing, unloading troops, and lifting off in under 60 seconds. The entire process was synchronized through visual cues alone. Colored smoke grenades, hand signals, and timing instinct honed through repetition. To the Viet Cong, this was chaos, but it was organized chaos. A captured diary from late 1967 recorded one commander's frustration. "The Americans attack like rain. They come from the sky. You shoot one, 3 return. The wind brings their machines faster than we can reload." Behind that psychological pressure was engineering precision. Bell's production line in Fort Worth had achieved something few defense programs ever did: a continuous flow of improvement without disrupting output. Each week, engineers tested minor refinements, introduced them into the next serial batch, and shipped those airframes to Vietnam within 90 days. The process blurred the line between research and combat feedback. At the same time, pilots were redefining what helicopters could do. Early manuals warned against flying below 50 feet or exceeding 80 knots. In Vietnam, Huey pilots ignored both. They flew nap of the earth, skimming tree lines so low their skids brushed leaves. They banked through ravines, dropped into clearings no wider than a 2-lane road, and used the aircraft's responsive cyclic control to pivot mid-air within a single rotor diameter. The Huey's flight controls, thanks to hydraulic servo boosters and the teetering rotor, responded instantly. No lag, no hesitation. For pilots trained on earlier models, it felt like an extension of their own reflexes. That agility saved lives daily. Pilots learned to dodge anti-aircraft bursts by instinct, dropping, flaring, and twisting in a way no fixed-wing craft could ever replicate. Enemy forces learned hard lessons trying to counter it. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong introduced more heavy machine guns, even radar-guided 37mm cannons, but the Huey's operating altitude, usually under 500 feet, placed it below radar coverage. Its slow speed and unpredictable flight paths made it nearly impossible to track. For ground troops, it seemed to appear out of nowhere. And there was one more element that no jet could match: intimacy. A jet dropped bombs and left. A Huey landed. The enemy could see the faces of the men inside. They could see the door gunners firing from 20 meters away, smell the exhaust, hear the pilot shouting over the rotor noise. It made combat immediate, personal, and terrifying. But for American troops, that same closeness made it something else: reassuring. They trusted the Huey like they trusted their rifles. It was always there. When the jungle exploded with gunfire and chaos, they didn't call for artillery. They called for the Huey, for medevac, for ammo, for extraction. The phrase, "dust off," helicopter evacuation, became sacred. Pilots flew through smoke and machine gun tracers to pick up wounded men, sometimes hovering on one skid because the landing zone was too small. One medevac pilot, Charles Kelly, famously ignored orders to pull back under fire. His last radio transmission, seconds before being hit, became legend: "When I have your wounded." Those words were engraved on the walls of field hospitals across Vietnam. They captured what the Huey truly symbolized: not just fear, but faith. Bell engineers would later say they never imagined they were building an icon. They built a workhorse, and the war turned it into a symbol of reliability, mobility, and endurance. By 1968, that symbol was everywhere. From the Mekong Delta to Khe Sanh, Hueys flew more daily missions than every other U.S. aircraft type combined. The Army called them flying jeeps. The enemy called them Iron Dragons. What no one disputed was this: no aircraft changed the rhythm of warfare more completely. It was the first time mobility, logistics, and firepower had all been fused into a single system. And it all rested on a machine that could be fixed in a muddy field with a wrench, a crowbar, and determination. That was the Huey's genius, and the engineers knew it. They'd built a helicopter that made strategy flexible, made soldiers faster, and made the enemy afraid to stand still. Thanks for listening till the end. I put a lot of effort to bring you factually correct and lesser-known stories of the past. Subscribe my channel if you like this type of content.